The day the new slave arrived was unlike any other the estate had ever witnessed. The mansion itself, sprawling and austere, seemed to hold its breath, as if it too knew that something extraordinary was entering its walls. The sun had barely risen, spilling a pale light over the cobblestone driveway, when the carriage appeared on the horizon, its wheels crunching against the gravel in a rhythm that echoed through the silent morning air. Servants paused in their duties, their hands frozen mid-motion, as though some invisible force had made them momentarily forget the world outside. There was a stillness, thick and heavy, that settled over the grounds, and the birds seemed to quiet their morning songs. It was as if the estate itself was aware that its equilibrium was about to be disrupted. The carriage doors opened slowly, revealing a figure that immediately drew every eye. The slave was unlike anyone the staff had ever seen, tall, lithe, and possessing a presence that was impossible to ignore. There was something both delicate and formidable about them, a paradox that made hearts race and curiosity spike. Their eyes were the first to be noticed, deep, searching, and impossibly aware, scanning their surroundings with a mixture of caution and defiance. Every step they took was measured, deliberate, and graceful, yet beneath that controlled exterior was a tension that suggested a life lived under scrutiny and control. The air around them seemed to thrum with unspoken energy, a quiet magnetism that drew attention without effort. The master of the estate, a man known for his strict rules and iron control, felt an unexpected stir as the slave was presented before him. He had dealt with countless servants and slaves before, each trained and molded into submission, yet none had elicited the sharp, electric curiosity that this one did. There was a spark, fleeting yet undeniable, that ignited the corners of his mind. He studied the slave with a clinical eye at first, noting posture, gait, and the subtle hints of character in the way they carried themselves. But it was deeper than observation. It was fascination. A whispering voice within him stirred, questioning why he felt this way, why this new presence unsettled and excited him simultaneously. The wife, elegant and poised, observed from behind the master, her gaze just as sharp, just as penetrating. She was a woman accustomed to having her world bend to her will, to shaping the desires and actions of those around her. Yet as she looked at the slave, something shifted within her. There was a magnetic pull, a dangerous curiosity that she could neither name nor deny. She noticed the way the slave's lips pressed into a line of quiet determination, the way their eyes occasionally flicked toward her with a spark of recognition, as though they understood the undercurrents of power and desire swirling in the room. It was a subtle dance, a silent communication that spoke volumes in moments when no words were exchanged. The staff, who had been tasked with welcoming the new arrival, found themselves unnerved. Whispers traveled through the halls like a slow, creeping fog. "Have you ever seen one like this?" one maid murmured, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and apprehension. "They are not like the others," replied another, her tone laced with nervous excitement. Every gesture, every glance from the slave seemed to carry layers of meaning, and it did not go unnoticed. Even those trained to observe and obey instinctively felt the tension in the air, a charged energy that suggested that the rules of the household were about to be rewritten. As the day progressed, the master and his wife both sought moments alone with the slave, almost instinctively. The first encounter, in the dim light of the morning, was quiet yet electric. The master asked questions, his tone measured, probing yet controlled, testing the slave's intelligence and resilience. The slave answered with precision, revealing a mind as sharp as it was cautious. There was an awareness in their responses, a subtle play of words that hinted at a depth far beyond their position in the household. It was an exchange that left the master both unsettled and enthralled, a dangerous combination that made him question the boundaries between possession and fascination. The wife, on the other hand, approached with a different tactic. She allowed herself to be casual, almost indifferent, yet every movement, every flicker of her gaze was calculated to draw attention. She asked questions about the slave's background, their past, their thoughts, all the while maintaining a graceful detachment. Yet beneath that veneer of calm, her mind was ablaze. She noted the way the slave's eyes widened slightly at certain words, the way a faint blush colored their cheeks at subtle compliments, and the way their posture shifted imperceptibly when she leaned closer. It was a dangerous game, and she reveled in the subtle power it gave her. The first evening was particularly intense. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the mansion's walls, the slave was guided to their quarters. The rooms were modest but immaculate, a reflection of the household's meticulous standards. Yet, as the door closed behind them, the air seemed to thicken, carrying the echoes of the day's tension. The master and his wife found themselves drawn to the corridors near the slave's room, unable to resist the pull of curiosity and desire. They lingered, caught in the silent pull of an attraction they could neither define nor ignore. The mansion, once a place of order and routine, now felt like a living organism, pulsating with anticipation, each room a stage for the subtle dramas unfolding within. By nightfall, the fascination had deepened into something more dangerous, something that bordered on obsession. The master found himself pacing the halls, thoughts consumed by the slave's presence, replaying their interactions in meticulous detail. Every word, every glance, every fleeting expression was analyzed and catalogued in his mind. He questioned his own reactions, feeling both shame and exhilaration at the intensity of his fascination. The wife, in her own quarters, mirrored his behavior. She reclined in her chaise ending to read, yet her eyes were constantly drawn to the doorway, imagining the slave's movements, their gestures, their expressions. The silent tension between them grew with every passing moment, an invisible thread weaving their desires together in ways neither could fully comprehend. The night deepened, and the mansion fell into a fragile quiet, yet even in the stillness the sense of anticipation lingered. The new arrival had changed the rhythm of the household, introducing a complexity that defied understanding. The master and his wife, both accustomed to control, now found themselves subtly manipulated by the presence of the slave. It was an influence that was as frightening as it was intoxicating. The household, once a place of predictable order, was now a delicate ecosystem of desire, tension, and unspoken rules, all orbiting around the enigmatic figure of the hermaphrodite slave. By the end of that first day, it was clear to both master and wife that nothing would ever be the same again. The air was thick with possibilities, danger, and desire, a combination that promised both pleasure and ruin. The slave had arrived as a new addition to the estate, yet their presence had already begun to reshape the very foundation of the household. They were no longer merely a servant or a possession. They were a force, a catalyst for the obsessions that were quietly awakening in both the master and his wife. In the flickering candlelight, as shadows danced across the walls, it seemed almost inevitable that this forbidden fascination would only grow stronger, pulling everyone into a web of desire and intrigue from which none could escape unscathed. From the moment the slave's presence became known, the atmosphere of the mansion changed in ways subtle yet irreversible. It began with small incidents, almost imperceptible shifts in routine and attention, but each one was loaded with meaning, tension, and unspoken desire. The master found himself lingering longer than necessary in the hallways, watching the way the slave moved, the fluidity of each motion, the delicate but deliberate gestures that seemed to speak in a language all their own. Every glance, every breath, every subtle expression carried weight. What had begun as fascination in the first day now began to ferment into something more dangerous, more consuming. The wife, equally captivated, discovered a similar pull that she could neither ignore nor explain. She observed with a mix of curiosity and possessiveness, measuring every step the slave took, noting the smallest hints of emotion on their face. There were moments when the slave would pause to listen, tilting their head slightly, eyes bright with attention, and the wife felt an unexpected thrill. Part admiration, part envy, part something she dared not name. In these early days, both master and wife were careful, subtle, yet every interaction with the slave was a negotiation of power, control, and emerging obsession. They were both attempting to assert dominance, while simultaneously being drawn into a gravity that neither had experienced before. The slave, aware of the undercurrents around them, moved with quiet intelligence. Each word they spoke, Each subtle gesture seemed to both appease and provoke. They were careful not to overstep, yet precise enough to capture attention. A slight hesitation before a response, a soft murmur that lingered longer than expected, a fleeting touch when helping with attire or arrangements. Each of these moments was charged with energy that neither master nor wife could resist. It was as if the slave had intuitively understood the delicate balance of desire and control and was manipulating it with a skill that unsettled everyone around them. Even mundane interactions became arenas of subtle tension. Mealtimes, once predictable and orderly, now carried a palpable anticipation. The way the slave served food, moved through the room, or even merely glanced at the master or wife sent shivers down their spines. They began to compete, almost unconsciously, for the slave's attention. Small comments, faint gestures of approval, or casual glances were all laden with unspoken messages, each one a challenge, a provocation, a test. There was a silent rivalry brewing, a dangerous dance of control and desire that neither dared to acknowledge openly. The household staff, ever observant, began to notice the change as well. Conversations in the kitchens, in the servant quarters, were hushed. Laden with speculation and curiosity, they spoke in whispers about the strange intensity of the master's gaze, the wife's sudden attentiveness, and the almost imperceptible power the slave seemed to wield without effort. There was fear, too, fear of the unknown, of the unnatural bond that seemed to be forming, of the obsession that was quietly consuming the heads of the household. Servants avoided the corridors where the master or wife lingered near the slave, sensing an invisible tension that might ignite at any moment. As days turned into weeks, the interactions between the trio grew increasingly complex. The master began seeking opportunities for private moments, asking the slave to assist in small tasks under the guise of supervision, yet finding any excuse to prolong the encounter. Every word exchanged carried weight, every gesture hinted at something more beneath the surface. Meanwhile, the wife cultivated her own moments of closeness, leaning in during discussions, offering gentle touches that lingered longer than propriety would allow. The slave, perceptive and calculating, responded to each with subtle nuance, enough to intrigue, enough to provoke, enough to deepen the obsession without ever breaking the delicate rules of the household. At times, the tension became unbearable. Both master and wife found themselves consumed with jealousy over even minor interactions between the slave and the other. A passing glance, a momentary smile, or a polite answer could send waves of possessiveness crashing through them. They were no longer merely fascinated, they were ensnared. The desire to dominate, to be recognized as the one who mattered most, created a tangled web of emotions that was impossible to untangle, and all the while, the slave remained the calm center of the storm, aware of the chaos they had provoked, yet careful to maintain an air of innocence and compliance. Nighttime, in particular, amplified the tension. The mansion, cloaked in darkness, seemed alive with whispered thoughts and unspoken desires. Hallways became stages for subtle encounters, where the faintest brush of hands or a shared glance could ignite a fire that neither master nor wife could control. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls, and the dim light seemed to heighten every emotion, every heartbeat, every longing glance. The slave moved through these moments with quiet grace, drawing both to them without overt action, commanding attention simply by being. The obsession was not merely physical, it was psychological. Both master and wife found their thoughts consumed by the slave, replaying encounters over and over, analyzing words, gestures, and expressions. Dreams at night were haunted by imagined interactions, fantasies that blurred the line between desire and reality. Even in their private moments together, they found themselves distracted, minds wandering to the slave, hearts racing at the memory of a glance, the echo of a whispered word, the track of a hand. It was a bond formed not through overt intimacy alone, but through an intricate interplay of attention, manipulation, and emotional tension. A bond that was forbidden, yet irresistible. The slave, meanwhile, maintained an air of quiet control. They understood the power they held without needing to speak it aloud. Each subtle movement, each carefully measured word, was a tool in the silent shaping of desire. They knew when to yield, when to resist, and when to provoke. They had become the pivot point around which the household's emotions revolved, and they wielded this influence with almost imperceptible skill. Master and wife, both accustomed to commanding others, found themselves subtly manipulated, drawn deeper into obsession with every passing day. As the bond deepened, boundaries blurred. Moments that would have been unthinkable at first, close touches under the guise of assistance, prolonged private conversations, shared laughter that carried unspoken undertones, became increasingly frequent. Both master and wife were caught in a constant state of tension, craving proximity, yet terrified of revealing the depth of their obsession. Every encounter was a test, a game of control and surrender, and the slave was the unspoken arbiter. The mansion, once a place of order and routine, had become a stage for forbidden desire, with each room echoing the silent power struggle that played out within its walls. Jealousy became a constant companion, the smallest perceived slight, an expression of attention to the other, sparked an immediate and almost uncontrollable reaction. Master and wife competed for dominance, not only over the slave, but over each other, their obsession feeding both rivalry and desire. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered word was carefully noted and interpreted, often leading to surges of jealousy or bouts of possessiveness. The air itself seemed charged with tension, the invisible threads of desire and rivalry intertwining in ways that made every interaction a delicate balancing act. In this intricate dance, the slave's awareness was both unnerving and enthralling. They had become more than a mere servant. They were a presence that could sway emotions, manipulate interactions, and intensify obsession without any overt action. They were the silent orchestrator of the household's transformation, the axis around which the master and wife's desires revolved. The fascination that had begun innocently had grown into a dangerous, consuming force, one that neither of the adults could resist or fully understand. By the end of the second month, the obsession had reached a fever pitch. The master and wife were no longer merely intrigued, they were consumed. Their thoughts were dominated by the slave, their actions increasingly guided by the need to assert control, gain attention, or provoke subtle responses. Even the smallest interactions became significant, laden with meaning, tension, and unspoken challenge. The mansion itself seemed to respond to this change, walls bearing silent witness to the evolving bond, corridors echoing with the hushed intensity of desire and rivalry. It became clear that what was forming was more than fascination. It was a forbidden bond, intricate, delicate, and dangerous. It was a connection forged not through mere attraction, but through a complex interplay of attention, power, jealousy, and manipulation. The master and wife were entwined, each driven by obsession yet separated by rivalry, both orbiting the hermaphrodite slave who stood at the center, aware of their influence yet maintaining an air of innocence that only deepened the captivation. The household had become a microcosm of desire, tension, and control, each day intensifying the forbidden bond in ways that were as exhilarating as they were perilous. Every moment, from casual glances to carefully orchestrated encounters, served to deepen this intricate connection. Both master and wife were caught in a slow, inexorable descent, their emotions entwined with longing, jealousy, and obsession. The slave, ever perceptive, guided this descent with subtlety and precision, ensuring that every interaction drew them further into a web from which escape was impossible. It was a dangerous equilibrium, a forbidden bond that consumed thought, action, and desire, leaving the household poised on the edge of obsession and ruin. By the end of the day, as candlelight flickered across the grand halls and the mansion set, led into a tense quiet, it was undeniable, the forbidden bond had been formed. Neither master nor wife could escape the pull of their fascination, nor could they resist the subtle power the slave held over them. What had begun as curiosity had transformed into obsession, a consuming force that would define the household, dictate actions, and shape every future encounter. And in the quiet stillness of the mansion, it was clear that the story of desire, control, and forbidden fascination had only just begun. The weeks that followed the establishment of the forbidden bond were like a slow-burning fire, one that neither the master nor his wife could extinguish. Each day brought subtle intensifications, imperceptible at first but mounting in pressure until the tension had grown into a near-physical presence. The mansion itself seemed transformed, its walls carrying whispers of desire, its corridors saturated with unspoken longing. Every movement of the slave became a source of fascination, every glance a spark that ignited a rush of emotion that was at once thrilling and terrifying. Both master and wife found themselves obsessively analyzing the smallest details, the tilt of the head, the cadence of speech, the way the slave's hands moved over tasks both menial and necessary. These moments, fleeting as they were, became central to their waking thoughts and nighttime fantasies alike. The master, once confident and self-assured in his control of the estate and its occupants, now found himself disarmed. The slave's presence seemed to bypass all of his defenses, reaching straight into his mind, pulling at curiosity, desire, and an unsettling envy he could barely admit to himself. He would pace the library for hours, replaying the day's interactions in his mind, noting every subtle shift in the slave's demeanor. Why had their eyes lingered on him for that extra second? Why had the slightest hesitation in response to a command felt so deliberate, so calculated? Each question festered, igniting a hunger for understanding, and yet the more he tried to grasp it, the further the answers seemed to slip away. The fascination became a gnawing presence, creeping into every thought, twisting mundane tasks into reminders of the slave's magnetic influence. The wife, equally consumed, experienced a different but no less powerful descent. Her fascination was intertwined with a sense of possession and control, yet also tinged with fear and envy. She had long been used to commanding attention and bending the desires of those around her, but the slave defied simple domination. In their presence, she felt a rare vulnerability, a thrill laced with a dangerous uncertainty. When the slave offered a fleeting smile, a tilt of the head, or a subtle comment, it stirred emotions she could neither name nor contain. These emotions were not passive, they were active, pressing her to test boundaries, to probe reactions, to assert herself in ways that were both deliberate and instinctive. The mansion's quiet corners became arenas for subtle psychological battles, where the unspoken tension between her, the master, and the slave simmered and grew. The household staff could sense the change. Even those sworn to obedience began to speak in hushed tones, remarking on the intensity of the master's and wife's attention to the slave. They noticed the lingering glances, the small signs of rivalry, the subtle gestures of attention that betrayed the depth of obsession. Whispers grew into careful speculation, and while no one dared speak openly in the presence of the master and wife, the undercurrent of unease spread like wildfire through the servant quarters. Each servant began to tread carefully, aware that a misstep in the gaze or a misinterpreted gesture could provoke consequences they could not predict. The mansion had become a stage for subtle power plays, emotional manipulation, and psychological tension, and everyone within it felt the strain of this invisible drama. It was in the private moments that the obsession intensified most vividly. The master would find excuses to engage the slave in prolonged tasks, lingering over minor corrections, offering gentle critiques, all the while reveling in the subtle reactions that betrayed delight, nervousness, or curiosity. Each interaction was a careful negotiation, a test of boundaries, and an exploration of the slave's responsiveness. Similarly, the wife created moments that appeared casual but were charged with implication. She would brush against the slave as they passed in the corridors, offer whispered compliments, or linger in their presence under the guise of supervision. The slave responded in ways that were measured yet undeniably captivating, maintaining an air of innocence while heightening the intensity of the master and wife's obsession. The psychological dimension of the obsession became increasingly pronounced. Master and wife, both accustomed to controlling their worlds, were now caught in a state of mutual fascination and rivalry. Each began to observe the other's interactions with the slave, analyzing tone, gesture, and expression with meticulous attention. They began to compare reactions, to measure subtle displays of jealousy or desire, each seeking affirmation of their primacy in the slave's attention. Yet the more they tried to dominate, the more the slave seemed to navigate their desires with uncanny precision, maintaining equilibrium while simultaneously deepening the emotional turmoil. This delicate balance created a tension that was both intoxicating and unbearable, a psychological tightrope they walked daily, aware that a single misstep could shatter the fragile order they had established. The nights amplified this tension to almost unbearable levels. The mansion, shrouded in darkness, became a labyrinth of anticipation, desire, and subtle competition. Every flickering candle cast shadows that seemed to echo the unspoken dynamics of the household. Footsteps. Along the corridors, the soft rustle of fabric, the quiet inhalation of breath, all became signals, cues, and provocations in an unspoken game of emotional dominance. The master and wife found themselves lying awake, hearts pounding, replaying imagined encounters, recalling fleeting glances, or anticipating the slave's next movement. Sleep offered no respite. Their minds were occupied entirely by the web of obsession that had ensnared them, leaving them in a constant state of psychological tension. Physical proximity, though restrained, served to heighten the obsession. The brush of a hand while assisting with a task, the fleeting touch of a shoulder as the slave passed, the subtle shift of posture or glance, all of these became moments of intense scrutiny and interpretation. Master and wife analyzed each gesture as if it were a declaration, each response a cipher to decode. Their obsession had become a compulsion, dictating behavior, shaping daily routines, and influencing decisions in ways both conscious and unconscious. Even the most mundane interactions, preparing meals, organizing the estate, supervising work, were suffused with an undercurrent of desire and psychological tension. The slave, ever perceptive, maintained an air of calm that only intensified the obsession. They understood the power they wielded and exercised it with subtlety. There was no overt manipulation, yet every word, every gesture, every pause was carefully calibrated to heighten interest, provoke zeal, arouse or inspire curiosity. They became the axis around which the master and wife's emotional world revolved, a presence that could both provoke and soothe, command attention, and elude control. In this way, the slave's influence grew daily, weaving a web of psychological tension that neither the master nor wife could escape. This growing obsession also began to manifest in emotional volatility. Both master and wife experienced sharp swings of jealousy, longing, and frustration. Minor interactions, such as a shared joke between slave and master, or a fleeting compliment from the slave to the wife, could ignite waves of envy and rivalry. Arguments became more frequent, yet each contained an underlying current of desire, a struggle for primacy that was both emotional and psychological. The tension between them was no longer about simple control or ownership. It had evolved into a complex entanglement of obsession, desire, and vulnerability that consumed their thoughts and actions alike. Even when separated, the obsession persisted. Moments alone provided no respite. Both master and wife found themselves constantly recalling the slave's expressions, gestures, and words. They analyzed each detail meticulously, seeking hidden meanings, imagining scenarios, and speculating on the slave's intentions. Every day, every encounter, and every memory became a piece of a larger puzzle, a puzzle they could never fully solve, yet were compelled to complete. Their fixation was not merely a of desire. It had become a psychological addiction, an all-encompassing force that dominated thought, emotion, and behavior. As time passed, the boundaries between fascination, desire, and rivalry blurred. What had begun as an initial curiosity had transformed into an obsession that dictated the rhythm of daily life. Master and wife found themselves trapped in a cycle of intense attention, subtle competition, and relentless anticipation. Their interactions with the slave became the defining moments of each day, the axis upon which every thought, emotion, and action revolved. The mansion itself seemed to mirror this transformation, its rooms echoing with tension, its corridors charged with anticipation, and its walls bearing silent witness to a psychological drama that had become all-consuming. By the end of this period, it was clear that the obsession had grown beyond simple fascination. The master and wife were no longer merely intrigued, they were enmeshed in a web of desire, jealousy, and psychological tension that threatened to consume them entirely. The slave had become more than a servant. They were the center of an intricate, forbidden triangle, the catalyst for emotions and desires that neither master nor wife could fully understand or resist. The mansion, once a place of order and routine, had transformed into a landscape of obsession, desire, and peril, where every glance, every gesture, and every whispered word carried weight and meaning far beyond its appearing. Even in moments of calm, the obsession lingered. Silence was charged with expectation, ordinary tasks were fraught with significance, and every encounter was imbued with tension. Master and wife, once confident in their control over the household, now existed in a state of emotional flux, constantly navigating the pull of desire, rivalry, and fascination. The slave's presence was a constant, unspoken force, guiding interactions, shaping emotions, and deepening the obsession with every passing day. The forbidden bond had matured into an all-consuming fixation, one that would continue to escalate, drawing all three into a complex and dangerous web from which there was no turning back. By the close of this phase, the mansion had become a crucible of obsession, a place where the boundaries of desire, control, and rivalry were constantly tested. The master and wife, each caught in their own psychological turbulence, found themselves unable to act with clarity, their thoughts dominated by the presence of the slave and the subtle power they wielded. The hermaphrodite, ever aware and calculating, remained the pivot of this intricate emotional machinery, guiding, provoking, and sustaining the obsession that had overtaken the household. In every glance, every word, and every touch, the fire of fascination, rivalry, and longing burned brighter, promising that the descent into obsession was far from complete. As the days stretched into weeks and months, the balance of the household began to shift in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. What had once been a triangle of curiosity and mutual fascination gradually transformed into a complex hierarchy of influence, one that the hermaphrodite slave controlled without overt action, without demand, yet with absolute precision. The master and wife, both so accustomed to command and dominance, were now caught in the orbit of someone they had thought was beneath them. Every glance, every gesture, every carefully measured word from the slave seemed to hold invisible weight, bending their will, igniting desire, and deepening obsession. What had begun as mutual fascination now became a contest in which the slave held the invisible reins, guiding, manipulating, and sustaining the growing tension with effortless skill. The slave's power was quiet at first, almost imperceptible. It was in the way they listened, always attentive, never missing a detail, a comment, or a subtle cue from either the master or wife. They moved with a grace that suggested both caution and control, measured and deliberate, their every action resonating with an almost hypnotic rhythm. It was in the way they spoke, soft, precise, and deliberate, each syllable weighted with intent, each pause calibrated to provoke reflection, anticipation, or longing. Even when performing the simplest household tasks, the slave's presence became magnetic. The master would find himself pausing, watching with a strange mixture of pride, desire, and fear at how easily the slave commanded attention without effort. The wife, equally captivated, experienced a similar pull, noticing the slightest detail and reading meaning where none might have been intended. But the slave ensured that each gesture, each expression, carried layers of complexity that fueled her obsession. The psychological tension grew with each passing day. Master and wife, both attempting to assert dominance, found themselves subtly undermined by the slave's awareness of their desires and vulnerabilities. A hesitation here, a deliberate linger there, a glance that suggested awareness beyond spoken words. all became tools in the slave's silent manipulation. Neither could openly acknowledge the effect for fear of revealing weakness to the other, yet both were deeply aware that the slave held an invisible power. They had become the axis of control around which every emotion, thought, and action revolved. Where once the household's authority rested clearly with master and wife, now it was divided, uncertain, constantly responding to the slave's silent guidance. Even minor interactions became stages for the display of this unspoken power. During meals, the slave would serve with a precision that seemed to exaggerate their attentiveness, offering a fleeting touch when presenting dishes, pausing in their movements to allow their presence to linger in the minds of both master and wife. When the master offered correction or guidance, the slave responded with subtle acknowledgement, an expression or gesture that both mollified and provoked. The wife, observing these exchanges, would feel a surge of competitive desire, wishing to assert her own dominance, only to find herself captivated by the slave's calm confidence and ability to navigate between them with quiet mastery. This dynamic extended into moments of solitude. The master, retreating into the library or study, found himself unable to ignore the presence of the slave. He imagined their movements, replayed earlier interactions in his mind, and anticipated the next moment of contact. Even when physically separated, the slave's influence lingered, shaping his thoughts and emotions in ways that were undeniable and uncontrollable. The wife experienced the same. She would catch herself tracing the imagined outline of the slave's gestures, recalling the weight of their gaze, and measuring each response against her own desires and insecurities. The slave had created a gravitational pull so strong that their absence did not diminish it, it only strengthened the compulsion. The subtle power extended beyond fascination and into manipulation of emotion. The slave, with their careful awareness, knew how to provoke jealousy, desire, and anxiety in equal measure. A fleeting glance at the master during an interaction with the wife could ignite sparks of possessiveness. A hesitation in response could heighten anticipation, and a quiet word of encouragement could unsettle the balance entirely. Each action was calculated to elicit reaction, and the reactions themselves were observed with a precision that further reinforced the slave's quiet dominance. The master and wife, both consumed with desire and rivalry, could not recognize the pattern fully, yet they responded instinctively, drawn deeper into the web. Even ordinary chores became charged with significance. When the slave arranged flowers in the drawing room, both master and wife found themselves drawn to watch, as though their mere presence transformed the mundane into something hypnotically compelling. When they polished silver or tidied personal quarters, each motion seemed to ripple through the household, an invisible signal of control and grace. These moments reinforced the idea that the slave could dictate attention and emotion without speaking a word, without direct command, and without even a conscious effort. Their power was intrinsic, subtle, and inescapable. The psychological grip extended to conversation. Master and wife found themselves caught in endless analysis of the slave's words, tone, and timing. A simple statement about a task or a request could carry multiple interpretations, each layered with meaning, each offering a pathway for obsession to deepen. They replayed every interaction in their minds, dissecting and imagining possibilities, constructing imagined responses, and speculating on intent. In this, the slave became both the subject and orchestrator of their internal narratives, guiding thoughts, emotions, and even the subtleties of rivalry between master and wife. The nights became the stage where the full weight of the slave's power was most palpable. As darkness fell and the household settled into relative quiet, the mansion seemed to hum with the tension of unspoken desires. Hallways became charged with anticipation. The faintest footsteps, the softest sound of fabric brushing against furniture, became signals loaded with implication. Both master and wife, awake and restless, found themselves imagining the slave's movements, gestures, and expressions, constructing intricate fantasies that fed obsession. Sleep offered no reprieve. Dreams were haunted by the slave's presence, replaying moments and encounters, often intensified, shaping emotions and thought in ways that were impossible to ignore. The slave's power extended even to moments of discipline and correction. When a minor mistake occurred, an errant dish placed incorrectly, a task done incompletely, the master might step forward, attempting to assert authority, only to find himself hesitant in the presence of the slave's composed gaze. A subtle word, a look that suggested both awareness and restraint, could undermine him, leaving him questioning his own judgment. The wife, watching from the corner of the room, might feel a surge of competitive emotion, wanting to intervene, yet equally captivated by the slave's quiet mastery of the situation. Each instance reinforced the idea that control was no longer absolute, and that the slave had become the pivot upon which power and desire balanced precariously. Even in shared moments between master and wife, the slave's influence could not be ignored. A glance, a gesture, a remembered word could intrude into private conversations, shaping tone, mood, and attention. They became a silent participant in every exchange, guiding emotions with subtlety, forcing both adults to navigate their own desires and insecurities under the unspoken shadow of the slave's presence. The mansion, once a predictable arena of authority and routine, had become a living landscape of psychological tension, obsession, and intrigue. Every corner held potential for manipulation, every shadow a stage for subtle control. The obsessive dynamic escalated with time. Master and wife began to seek approval, validation, and recognition from the slave in ways that were unmistakable, yet carefully hidden from one another. Each sought to assert primacy in attention and influence, creating a silent rivalry that the slave skillfully maintained. Jealousy became a constant companion, fueling desire and intensifying fixation. Every gesture, glance, and word from the slave carried amplified significance, each interaction reinforcing the psychological hold they had over both adults. By now, the household's daily rhythm was dictated by the slave's presence. Meals, work, leisure, and rest were subtly shaped by where and when the slave moved, what attention they offered, and how they responded. Master and wife found themselves planning days around moments of proximity, interactions, and observation. Their lives, once ruled by logic and authority, were now orchestrated around a presence they could neither resist nor fully comprehend. The power dynamic had been inverted. The slave, outwardly subordinate, had become the invisible architect of their emotional and psychological landscapes. Even in moments of confrontation or attempted resistance, the slave's influence remained unassailable. When either master or wife sought to impose authority, the slave would respond with quiet calm, a subtle acknowledgement, or a fleeting gesture that diffused tension while simultaneously deepening intrigue. There was no rebellion, no overt defiance, only the quiet mastery of understanding human desire and psychology, their ability to maintain balance while controlling attention and emotion reinforced the magnetic hold they had over the household. By the end of this phase, it was undeniable the slave's power was absolute in its subtlety. Master and wife, each caught in obsession, jealousy, and desire, had become instruments of the very dynamic they once thought they controlled. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with the tension created by their fixations, every room and corridor echoing with the influence of the hermaphrodite slave. Their presence had transformed the household into a complex web of psychological dominance, emotional dependency, and forbidden fascination. A web which neither master nor wife could escape. The slave had become more than a servant. They were the axis of desire, the unseen hand guiding attention, emotion, and obsession. Every glance, every word, every gesture reinforced their dominance without breaking the rules of subservience, without overt action. The forbidden bond, once a mutual fascination, had matured into a carefully orchestrated dynamic of power, obsession, and psychological mastery. Master and wife were enthralled, ensnared, and irrevocably changed. The mansion, and all who dwelled within it, existed now in the orbit of this subtle but absolute power, a power wielded silently, invisibly, and completely. The mansion had become a vessel of obsession, a labyrinth where desire and control collided in ways that defied reason. By this point, the master and wife no longer experienced moments of respite from their fixation on the hermaphrodite slave. Every thought, every action, every fleeting glance was interpreted, dissected, and replayed endlessly in their minds. Sleep had become a fragile illusion. Dreams were haunted by the slave's presence, replaying gestures, words, and expressions with amplified intensity. Even in the rare moments when they sought to distract themselves with work, leisure, or conversation with each other, their minds were inexorably drawn back to the slave, whose subtle influence had become a permanent anchor on their emotions. Obsession had mutated into an inescapable mania, each heartbeat a reminder of the power the slave now wielded. The days were no longer structured by tasks or schedules, but by the anticipation of the slave's attention. The master found himself scrutinizing every movement, memorizing the curve of a shoulder, the tilt of the head, the cadence of a whispered word. He would invent reasons to linger in the same room, to prolong a moment of proximity, to feel the faint brush of a hand or the subtle warmth of their gaze. The wife did the same, plotting moments of interaction under the guise of supervision, offering compliments or fleeting touches designed to provoke responses she could barely control herself. Each interaction, no matter how minor, carried the weight of emotional warfare, an invisible contest for attention, dominance, and validation that neither could resist participating in, yet both knew could never be openly acknowledged. The psychological tension between master and wife reached a fevered pitch. Every interaction with the slave was filtered through a lens of jealousy and rivalry. If the master praised or complimented the slave, the wife's eyes would flash with subtle fury, her mind racing through imagined scenarios, questioning the meaning of a glance or the implication behind a word. Likewise, the master could not ignore moments when the slave responded to the wife with acknowledgement or attention, each slight bending his pride and stoking the fire of possessiveness. The mansion itself seemed to absorb this tension, its walls and corridors echoing with the unspoken conflict. While the slave remained an almost divine observer, subtly shaping their emotional turmoil without lifting a hand. Even in the quietest moments, the obsessive tension was unrelenting. The master would pace the dimly lit corridors at night, replaying every word, every glance, every pause, wondering if he had missed some nuance, some signal, some clue to the slave's intentions. He would recall the way a hand had brushed against his sleeve, the faint smile that lingered too long, or the way the slave's eyes seemed to hold secret understanding. The wife, in her private quarters, mirrored this compulsion, tracing imagined gestures on her fingertips, whispering their name in the dark and replaying the smallest interactions as though decoding a complex cipher. The slave had become an omnipresent force, not merely observed but internalized, dominating their thoughts even when absent. The obsession manifested physically as well as mentally. Both master and wife found themselves drawn irresistibly into proximity, needing to witness, to feel, to engage with the slave in ways that went beyond polite attention. Even casual gestures, a hand extended to pass a tray, a shoulder brushing against theirs while assisting in a task, a simple glance from across the room, ignited a rush of emotion that was impossible to suppress. Each encounter, no matter how brief, left them trembling with desire, frustration, and unspoken competition. The slave's subtle awareness amplified this, prolonging glances, pausing gestures, or inserting tiny delays that intensified anticipation and jealousy. It was a mastery of influence that neither master nor wife could resist, a power wielded silently yet completely. The household itself became a pressure cooker of obsession. Servants whispered in quiet corners, noting the increasingly erratic behavior of their superiors, the tension that permeated every room, and the way both master and wife seemed to orbit the slave's presence. Every room became a stage for unspoken competition and emotional warfare, and even mundane tasks became fraught with meaning. A misplaced item, a delayed response, or an unintentional smile could provoke waves of jealousy, longing, or desire, and the slave, ever perceptive, exploited each instance with a subtle, almost imperceptible precision. The mansion, once a symbol of control and order, had transformed into a theater of obsession, its architecture echoing with the silent drama unfolding within its walls. The nights were the most intense. Darkness amplified every emotion, every heartbeat, every flicker of movement. The master would lie awake, imagining the slave's gestures, replaying moments of interaction, questioning the meaning behind every word. He would invent scenarios in which he might assert dominance, only to feel the invisible weight of the slave's awareness, their calm presence undermining his imagined power. The wife's nights were no less tortured. She would lie in the dark, tracing the giant lines of the slave's fingers, replaying conversations and imagining subtle interactions that had not even occurred. Sleep offered no escape, only a continuation of the obsession in the form of dreams where the slave remained the axis around which desire, jealousy, and psychological turmoil revolved. Even attempts to assert control became exercises in futility. The master would issue instructions, expecting compliance and perhaps a sense of dominance, only to find the slave's subtle compliance, slight hesitation, or measured response provoking anxiety, jealousy, and longing in equal measure. The wife, attempting similar influence, found herself ensnared in the same dynamic. Each subtle interaction, whether a word, gesture, or glance, carried layers of meaning and consequence, deepening the obsessive tension that now dominated the household. Neither could escape. Both were trapped in a cycle of desire, frustration, and subtle manipulation orchestrated by the hermaphrodite slave. The obsession began to erode the clarity of their judgment. Simple tasks became secondary to the compulsion to observe, interpret, and anticipate the slave's behavior. Decisions, once made with reason and logic, were now filtered through the prism of desire and jealousy. Both master and wife began to act impulsively, reacting to imagined slights or subtle gestures with intensity that surprised even themselves. The slave's mastery lay in the fact that none of these reactions could be openly attributed to them. They remained calm, measured, and seemingly innocent, yet every move was designed to manipulate, provoke, and deepen the obsession. Social interactions within the household began to shift as well. Guests, rare though they were subtly kept at a distance, and the focus of attention increasingly centered on the slave. Meals, gatherings, and even casual walks around the estate became opportunities for the master and wife to observe, anticipate, and compete subtly for the slave's attention. The household rhythm itself became dictated by the presence and movements of the hermaphrodite, who, though outwardly compliant and obedient, had become the pivot point around which the emotional and psychological world of their masters revolved. The obsession was now a form of madness. Neither master nor wife could focus on their duties or even on each other without being drawn back to the slave. Every word spoken, every glance exchanged, every gesture made was loaded with meaning, constantly dissected, imagined, and replayed. The mansion had become a theater where the hermaphrodite orchestrated a silent, relentless psychological drama, one in which master and wife were both participants and prisoners. Their obsession was no longer optional. It had become an all-consuming force, dictating thoughts, desires, and actions with relentless precision. Even attempts at conversation between master and wife, without the slave present, became strained, haunted by the unspoken ion of their obsession. Words were carefully measured, glances were loaded with suspicion, and gestures were scrutinized as if every interaction might reflect the other's desire for the slave. The relationship that had once been partnership was now fractured, defined by rivalry, jealousy, and mutual obsession over someone who remained calm, composed, and utterly aware of the power they wielded. Every day was a delicate dance, every interaction a calculated balance of attention and restraint, and the slave remained the silent, omnipotent conductor. As the days progressed, the obsession reached a point where reason could no longer compete. Both master and wife experienced moments of intense jealousy, despair, and desire that left them physically and emotionally drained. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with the intensity of their emotions. The corridors carried the weight of unspoken longing, and the rooms echoed with subtle competitions of attention, dominance, and emotional manipulation. The slaves' presence was inescapable. Even their absence was felt as a gravitational pull, guiding thoughts, stirring desires, and provoking jealousy in ways neither master nor wife could resist. By now, the descent into madness was complete. The master and wife could no longer separate themselves from the obsession that had consumed their lives. Every action, every thought, every fleeting moment was dominated by the slave's influence. The mansion, once a symbol of order, control, and refinement, had become a crucible of desire, jealousy, and psychological unraveling. The hermaphrodite, ever perceptive and calculating, remained the calm epicenter, orchestrating their obsession with subtlety, precision, and near-perfect awareness of their emotional vulnerabilities. Every day was now a test, a contest, and a descent deeper into desire and fixation. The master and wife, though powerful in the world outside the mansion, had become prisoners of the forbidden bond they shared with the slave. The mansion echoed with the intensity of this obsession. Footsteps carried tension, glances sparked envy, and the simplest interactions became emotionally charged performances. There was no escape, no reprieve, no end in sight, only the relentless pull of desire, jealousy, and psychological domination orchestrated by the hermaphrodite, who had become both the object and arbiter of their obsessive madness. Even the smallest of actions, adjusting a garment, arranging flowers, moving through a corridor, could ignite waves of emotional intensity. Master and wife replayed these moments in private, dissecting, imagining, and anticipating, further feeding the obsessive cycle. Their relationship with each other was irrevocably altered, fractured by desire, jealousy, and rivalry, while the slave maintained a calm, unassailable presence at the center of the storm. The mansion itself had become a living symbol of obsession, a place where psychological control, desire, and forbidden fascination intertwined to create a reality from which neither master nor wife could escape. By the end of this period, it was clear that madness had fully taken hold. The master and wife were no longer merely captivated, they were consumed, utterly dominated by obsession, jealousy, and desire. The hermaphrodite slave had become the pivot of their lives, the force around which all emotion and action now revolved. The mansion, the household, and every room within it had become a stage for a relentless drama of obsession and psychological domination. Nothing would ever be the same again. The forbidden bond had reached its terrifying and intoxicating apex, leaving all three irrevocably changed, trapped in a cycle of desire, jealousy, and obsession that would continue indefinitely.